Hi, I'm Dustin Abbott, and I've really enjoyed my time with the new Fuji XF 56mm F1.2. But before I sent it back, I wanted to compare it to what is also a really excellent portrait option that is on X-mount, and that is the Viltrox Pro AF 75mm F1.2. Now, realize the focal length is not the same. The aperture is, however, and in many ways the performance is the same. So I thought that I would kind of do a deep dive into them and compare them in a variety of ways to maybe help you make an informed decision if you are looking for what is the better option for you when it comes to your portrait work, or for a kind of a short to medium telephoto lens with a very large maximum aperture. Both these lenses are extremely capable on 40 megapixels, zero problems there. In terms of absolute sharpness, you're not going to have any issue with either one of them. The answer as to which one is better is a little bit complicated. First of all, as noted, these aren't the same focal length. We have what is an 85mm equivalent on full frame, and then a unique focal length that is 112.5mm in the Viltrox. And so kind of splitting the difference between 85 and 135mm. It's actually a really interesting focal length for portraiture, but we'll dive into that in just a moment. Both of these have 11 rounded aperture blades, so do a good job of keeping a circular shape when they're stopped down. Both of them have thorough weather sealing. In fact, they have identical 9 different seal points, starting with the gasket throughout the lens itself, and then a special coating on the front to help with fingerprints and moisture. So in many ways, very, very similar lenses in terms of some of the premium options here. But we're going to break down what is, I think, strengths for either lens. And then if you want an optical deep dive, we'll do that at the end. And so you can see them compared in a variety of settings side by side. So first of all, let's talk about reasons to choose the Viltrox, which is over here to my left. The first reason for that is price. You can get the Viltrox for $549 US versus on sale right now $899 for the Fuji, though there's a discount coupon code that's in the description down below where you can get the Viltrox even cheaper, about 8% off of that price. And so you can get a really good value for the Viltrox compared to the Fuji. So if budget's an issue, well, the Viltrox might be a compelling option. If it matters to you having an AF-MF switch, it is something that the Viltrox has and the Fuji does not. Now, I will say that on a practical level, because Fuji designs their lenses to not have an AF-MF switch, it's not necessarily always practical to have one, for the simple reason that the most typical way that you're going to control that is through, the actual switch or lever on the camera itself. And so it is an alternative, but if you're accustomed to shooting Fuji all the time, probably your muscle memory is to switch through that camera-based switch rather than the lens barrel itself. So, but anyway, it's something that the Viltrox has that Fuji does not. I found that in my comparison test that while both of these lenses are quite excellent when it comes to controlling chromatic aberrations, the Viltrox is a little better still. It is close to apochromatic levels, basically hardly any kind of fringing of any kind on it. So it's really exceptional in that regard. Now, when it comes to autofocus, this is Fuji after all, and so autofocus is a little bit of a mixed bag, as we're going to see. But I would say that the Viltrox, if I'm comparing them side by side, I'm going to give a win to the Viltrox when it comes to quieter autofocus. And while there is some issues here, you can see the Viltrox pulls back and forth, and you can see there is some stepping, some of those things that unfortunately are pretty common on Fuji. At the same time, however, it is noticeably quieter when you are actually focusing. And I did note when I was doing, my side-by-side short portrait session to test these two lenses and attempting to get identical conditions, the Viltrox was perfectly focused every single time, whereas there was one miss for the Fuji. So, just ever so slightly better focus accuracy in my portrait setting. Now, because the focus motor here is smoother and quieter, I also found that I got a better manual focus experience. Mirrorless lenses use a focus-by-wire system, which means that input on the focus ring is mounted through the focus motor. And so, unfortunately, the focus motor really comes into play with that. And in this case, because the Viltrox's focus motor is a little bit smoother and quieter, it's a lead screw type STM versus a DC motor in the Fuji lens, meant that the manual focus experience here, the simulation of manual focus was just a little bit better with the Viltrox. I also found in terms of some of the optical strengths that this Viltrox has slightly softer bokeh. It also has, because of having a longer focal length, in a variety of situations, it has more potential to produce a more strongly blurred background. It will allow you to have more subject separation because of that bit of compression. So if your preference is shooting more like full body portraits, the Viltrox is going to give you a little bit more distinct images in that setting. I also noted that when you're shooting at wide apertures, it is slightly sharper in the center of the frame and in the mid frame. And so that is and again, it's not by any kind of significant margin. These lenses are very close optically, but the Viltrox is slightly the winner in those metrics. So how about some reasons to choose the Fuji here? Now, the size of the Fuji is kind of off-put by the fact that it's got a rather huge lens hood here. So particularly if we eliminate these lens hoods, you can see both here on my table, but also in this comparison shot that the Fuji is significantly smaller. It is 80 millimeters versus 87 millimeters in diameter, which means that we've got a 6-7 millimeter front filter thread versus a 77 millimeter front filter thread. So significant difference there. There's even more significance in the size when it comes to the length. The Fuji lens is only 76 millimeters in length, whereas the Viltrox is 101 millimeters. So that's an additional 25 millimeters, basically 25% longer. And so obviously that's going to be significant. That also kind of carries on to the weight. The Fuji weighs in at 445 grams, while the Viltrox is a fairly hefty 670 grams. And when you're holding these two lenses side by side, you can definitely feel that difference. This is a lens that if you're someone that gets fatigued carrying around a heavier lens, the Viltrox is probably not going to be the one for you. A huge improvement to the WR version of the Fuji here, this newest lens, is it has a significantly improved minimum focus distance and maximum magnification, up to 0.14 times magnification, whereas the Viltrox is stuck at a quite poor, similar to the old 56mm lens, 0.10 times magnification. So as you can see here, you can get significantly closer with the Fuji lens, and you can get a significantly higher degree of magnification. Opens up more versatility for the kinds of shots that you're going to be able to get with the lens. Now, surprisingly, considering it has the smaller diameter, the Fuji lens is actually the one with the less amount of vignette. It's about a full stop difference of a vignette in the corners, and so this lens gives you less of a heavy vignette, and so that's going to impact your image quality. I also found that it was a little bit sharper in the corners, whereas the Viltrox has more of an advantage in the center and mid-frame. Definitely when you get out to the corners, I favor the performance of the Fuji lens. And I also noted, just kind of comparing images side by side on a global level, not the micro contrast, but on a global level, I felt like the Fuji images had just slightly more contrast pop to them compared to the Viltrox lens. Again, both these lenses are fantastic optically. Those are just a few kind of subtle differences between the two. So I would say that both of these lenses are obviously great portrait options. So why should you choose the Viltrox? Choose the Viltrox if you're looking for more background compression and subject isolation. Particularly if you want to shoot full-length portraits, it's a really tempting option for that because it's going to behave a lot like a 135mm type lens in that regard, particularly when it's paired with such a huge maximum aperture. I think in many ways it is a superior alternative to a lens like the 90mm f2, obviously for a lot less money. The 56mm F1.2 WR is what I would consider a more versatile lens. It is more versatile in the sense that that shorter focal length, you can do more things with it. You need less operating room to work with. I also find that because of that close focus ability, it opens up more options. Say if you're a portrait photographer or a wedding photographer that likes to maybe isolate a few details, you have more options to do that with the 56mm than what you do with the Viltrox 75mm. At the end of the day, there's also the consideration of budget. And so is the Fuji lens worth about $350 more? Well, obviously that's something that you're going to have to decide for yourself. Now, if you want even more information, you can look in the description down below, and I do have linkage to both my text reviews for either of these lenses and also their individual video reviews if you'd like to see that. And you can stay tuned right now and we'll do a deeper optical dive together so you can really see them side by side. So let's start by taking a look at vignette and distortion. You can see for really neither of these lenses is any kind of distortion and issue, so that's not really worth talking about. Viltrox exhibits just a little bit more vignette than what the Fuji does. If there's any plus to the Viltrox, you can see here that it is quite a linear pattern, and so it can be quite complementary to portrait work, kind of depending on it. The Fuji's is a little bit more concentrated in the corners, and so thus a little bit less linear in its process, but definitely the Fuji has less vignette wide open. Now for these comparisons, we're going to keep the Viltrox on the left, the Fuji on the right. This is a 200% magnification, 40 megapixels here, so obviously lots of resolution. So we can see, looking in the center of the frame, that there is just a little bit more contrast for the Viltrox lens. You can just see there's a little bit more texture in the lines here than what you can see over on that side. If you take a look at here, there's just a little bit more rich details in this area, also in the text there. If we look at the mid frame, it's a little bit more obvious a win for the Viltrox, just a little bit better detail and contrast there. Moving down to the corners, however, we can see the Fuji takes over with the win. Outside of maybe just that last little bit, for some reason the Viltrox kind of bounces back, but overall I would say the corners look better on Fuji. We can see that's true over this side as well, where there's definite improvement here and then into the Queen's face over on the Fuji side of things. We stop both lenses down to f2. We can see that the results are largely the same. I think that the Fuji has sharpened up nicely, and so it's more competitive in the center of the frame. In the mid frame, there's still a little bit better result for the Viltrox. You can see the Viltrox is looking stunningly good. And down into the corners, however, that advantage remains the same as it did, looking better for Fuji than what it does for Viltrox. Now stopping down a little bit further to f4, we can see that in the middle of the frame, I would say that the Fuji looks a little bit better to me now. It's maybe pulling off a little bit better a result as it stopped down. I think that's true here as well. And if we look into the corners, the Viltrox is obviously looking better in the corners, but I would say that stop down, the Fuji is just a little bit more consistent in terms of its sharpness. Now, neither one of these lenses is what you would call a paper tiger. Even when you're talking about real-world, three-dimensional objects, you can see that both of them hold up really, really fantastic. I mean, the detail and contrast here is just fabulous. Just zero issues with either one of them. For either one of them, looks really, really amazing. I can't really pick a winner. They both look fantastic to me. Now, as we already noted, the amount of magnification possible here is exhibiting the maximum magnification for both lenses. And so there's an obvious win for the Fuji in that regard, the ability to get closer. And if we look here when it comes to the chromatic aberrations here, we can see that both of them are controlling CA really well. However, the Viltrox just a little bit better, so just a little bit less fringing here as opposed to what you're seeing on the Fuji side of things. Again, neither one of them is bad, but there's just a little bit more showing on the Fuji side. Now, obviously, if you take the minimum focus distance out of the equation and you shoot from the same distance, the Viltrox is going to have some advantage. It's going to have the advantage in a higher magnification of the subject and thus more defocus on the background. And so, there's some give and take when it comes to this. That's a bit more obvious in this particular comparison, in that you can see that I did move a little bit closer for the Fuji shot, but that the ability of the Viltrox to really compress the background means that, as you can see here, there's just a softer overall background compared to the Fuji has a slight bit more busyness here than what the Viltrox does. It can make that background just a little bit creamier. Again, both of them do a great job on the actual subject. Subject looks fantastic, but the background does slightly favor the Viltrox. You can see in this shot, I've worked a little bit harder at equalizing the overall size of the object in the frame. And it's hard to do with different focal lengths to get it perfect because it never quite lines up perfectly. But you can see the way that they're going to render a background is different as a byproduct. There's more compression involved. Even moving the Fuji ahead, the Viltrox has more compression. Thus, the background is more strongly defocused. And so that's just a consideration you have to take in mind. Looking at the two images side by side, both of them have really great looking contrast for an f1.2 lens. There's something about the Fuji's rendering that maybe is just slightly better, though again, if you look up close, you can see that the micro contrast on the Viltrox lens is really fantastic. And so I'm looking more at maybe the global contrast here. Now, I was shooting this particular image to try to evaluate color between the two. And I would say that I do very slightly kind of instinctively favor what comes from the Fuji. But at the same time, you can see with them side by side, there's really not much of a difference. Very, very slight differences of color tone in the greens. We're going to see here in a moment with skin tones, the Viltrox is slightly cooler than what the Fuji lens is, but there really isn't a radical difference in their color. Now, both lenses are good with their micro contrast, and we can see here composed out towards the edge. Both of them look good. I will say that the Viltrox looks a little bit better. Their, near apochromatic design here looks really fantastic in these fine details, but neither image is falling apart as far as the fringing in these high contrast areas, so a good job from both of them. So we'll take a quick look at a series to evaluate the bokeh quality here, to just give you an idea of how it plays out. And so as far as the wide open look and thus the geometry here, you can see that the Viltrox is very slightly rounder than what the Fuji is. The Fuji has a little bit more of a cat eye shape towards the edge of the frame. However, what I also see is that where it's nearly perfectly round, the Fuji has a little bit rounder a shape, whereas you can see, even at f1.2, you can see a little bit of the aperture iris shape there from the Viltrox. So a little bit of give and take between the two. Now you can see by f2 that both lenses are capable of producing very round specular highlights across the frame, so that's not an issue. What we can also see is that even when I try to, kind of equate for the size difference, you're always going to get very slightly and bigger bokeh specular highlights out of the Viltrox lens because of that longer focal length, thus a little bit more compression. Now, our final comparison is a couple of portrait side-by-side shots. And so here, taking a look at them globally at f1.2, you can see the background is going to be a little bit more defocused, even though I moved in to try to get the same kind of framing with the Viltrox, or excuse me, with the Fuji. You can see that, again, the Viltrox is capable of just slightly more background blur. Now, if we jump in and take a look at our faces here, you can see that, as I noted, skin tones are a little bit cooler and a little on the Viltrox, a little bit warmer on the Fuji. Now, as far as the amount of contrast that is there is a little bit more from the Viltrox wide open, I would say. If you look at the area around the eyelashes, you can see that there's just a little bit more contrast here than what there is here. In both cases, I would say that the skin tones look nice. It really comes down to a taste. If you like a little bit warmer, the Fuji's nicer. If you like a little bit cooler, the Viltrox is nicer. Both of them are doing a fabulous job here. One thing I will point out is that if you're looking in tight like this, there is obviously just a little bit more blur from the Viltrox looking towards the background compared to the Fuji. But I mean, again, without them being side by side like this, you probably wouldn't notice it. So finally, let's take a look at an f2 comparison. So stop down a little bit more. You can see once again the Viltrox background is going to be a little bit more blurred for the reasons we've already discussed. One other thing I will also point out is the difference in the focal length here. So you can see that the 85mm equivalent here gives a little bit narrower a face shape than what the Viltrox does. It's a little bit more compression, so the face looks a little bit rounder. And so just maybe something to consider if you are a portrait photographer, something to play with there. So again, we can see skin tone difference here. It also kind of plays out in the hair. You can see where the hair looks a little bit lighter and for the Fuji and a little bit darker for the Viltrox. Again, this is really down to taste at this point. Technically, both of these lenses are doing a really, really great job. Hopefully, however, this does help you to get a better sense of which you prefer optically. So hopefully this optical review has helped you to decide which one of these lenses appeals to you more, or maybe neither one of them, and that's fine too. Thanks for watching, have a great day, and let the light in.